She couldn't have vanished into thin air. Are you sure, you sir?
In this video, we'll talk about mystery, dismemberment, and porn-like plot twists. But this isn't an analysis of a Lars von Trier film, but an investigation of the fairy tales we loved as children. The original versions of our favorite bedtime stories are dark, violent, and gruesome enough to scare an adult. So let's see how fairy tales changed and developed over time, and what we overlooked when reading them as kids. If you like our literature videos, subscribe to our channel and tell your friends about us. Did you know that the original fairy tales were quite different from their modern versions? Sleeping Beauty was raped, not kissed. Rapunzel's prince had his eyes poked out, and Cinderella's sisters cut off their toes to fit in the glass slipper. There are several reasons for violence in fairy tales. First, there are historical reasons. Fairy tales originate from weakened religious myths. A myth served as a history book in the ancient world. It explained how the world began, the relationship between people and gods, and what happened after death. A myth is inextricably linked to a ritual, a sequence of activities performed during a religious act. Rituals are essential when it comes to social life. Some rituals facilitate the transition between life stages. So, a wedding, a funeral, and other rites of passage are there to make important life changes easier. In the past, a new social status was acquired through rituals that often involved overcoming dangerous obstacles. For example, a boy would be left in the forest to test his survival skills. That was an important part of a boy's transition from childhood to adulthood. Scientists today refer to this ritual as a rite of passage. By overcoming obstacles, an adolescent undergoes symbolic death to be reborn in a new status. Naturally, people's ideas about the world and its laws changed over time. And while myths became less convincing, rituals turned out to be much more enduring. So, that's why various elements of myths and rituals permeate fairy tales. The fairy tale violence has another origin too. Gruesome stories make any story scarier and more exciting. In the past, people also needed a fright from time to time.
You pitiful, insignificant fool! Look out! Now I am the ruler of all the ocean! The waves obey my every whim!
Why then did fairy tales undergo such severe censorship? That had actually a lot to do with how the surviving texts and stories reached us. There are two primary sources of fairy tales: 18th century writings and oral storytelling. Originally, fairy tales were intended for adults. Telling stories was an enjoyable pastime. However, over time, they became a children's activity too. Fairy tales were often told to children by nannies and governesses, who tended to smooth things over. This way, children wouldn't get too excited and fall asleep quicker. For example, Charles Perrault learned about fairy tales that way. The stories were often changed and added to by those who told them. If the Grimm brothers tried not to meddle with the plots, Charles Perrault didn't think twice before changing the original stories. Remember when the woodcutter cuts the wolf open with an axe and saves Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother? That scene is horrible enough despite being a milder version of the story. In the original tale, the wolf didn't swallow grandmother whole. Instead, he made a stew out of her flesh and a drink out of her blood. He then hid in the bed and watched Little Red Riding Hood eat her grandmother. After the meal, the girl took off her clothes and got into bed where the wolf was hiding. That's how the story ended in multiple versions of the tale. Well, indeed, there's nothing more to add here. Charles Perrault, however, changed the plot of this folktale dramatically, added the happy ending, and even included a moral lesson for those who couldn't figure it out for themselves. Young girls should never trust strangers. We are used to fairy tales being educational, informative, and entertaining stories for kids. That's why many fairy tales today are criticized for teaching children the wrong things. For example, Cinderella teaches kids to be selfless and disregard their wishes to please others. No wonder many people don't want children to think that self-denial is the way to success. Besides, the contemporary story of Cinderella presents marriage as the ultimate life goal for a girl. But, in fact, fairy tales were not originally intended to be educational. They were something entirely different. Fairy tales have their own systems of laws and rules. Indeed, the original fairy tales might seem unnecessarily violent to contemporary readers. Would anyone actually make their stepdaughter a servant? Why did people in the past not think it was a big deal? However, fairy tales are very complex. The horrifying things in them are symbols that aren't always obvious. The heritage of fairy tales permeates contemporary literature. Check out our European literature course to wrap your head around the European literary tradition. Get this course separately or consider our paid subscription to learn it all.
Don't touch Touch the spindle. Touch it, I say.
As you have probably guessed, the original story of Sleeping Beauty isn't nearly as innocent as the Disney version or Charles Perrault's version. The prince doesn't awaken her with true love's kiss. Instead, he rapes her and leaves. She gives birth to their children, and one of them sucks out the enchanted splinter from her finger. That's a horrifying story for contemporary readers. However, the tale is based on archaic meanings that we aren't used to these days. The eternal sleep, death, is contrasted to life here. Therefore, sexual intercourse and masculinity symbolize life. The prince literally awakens the libido of Sleeping Beauty, and she is reborn in a new state. She becomes a woman and a wife who can create life herself. It is only natural that, after Sleeping Beauty awakes from her sleep, so do the castle and its inhabitants. The plot of The Sleeping Beauty is a common narrative which can be found in folk tales all over the world. It's quite similar to the story of Snow White, where the theme of death is further complicated by having to share a living space with 7 dwarves. This plot is also common around the world. For example, Alexander Pushkin wrote A Tale of the Dead Princess and the 7 Knights, where the princess lives with her 7 stepbrothers. Vladimir Propp, a prominent folklore theorist, believed that this theme was a reference to an archaic custom that involved all-male houses. These houses were made for the rituals and gatherings of men in ancient communes. Women often lived there too. A woman in an all-male house was the wife of all the men in that commune. Moreover, the fact that these women had multiple sexual partners wasn't condemned in any way. Hence, the relationship between Snow White and the dwarves or the 7 knights possibly wasn't platonic at all.
There, I knew it was my slipper. Oh, it's exactly my size. I always wear the same size. As soon as I saw it, I said, oh, well,
The plot of Cinderella is also a widespread narrative which goes back as far as ancient Egypt. A courtesan named Rhodopis had her sandal snatched by an eagle while she was bathing. The sandal was taken to the king, who was so amazed by the shoe's small size that he married Rhodopis. Chinese culture is also famous for its attention to the size of women's feet. Foot binding was a common way of changing the size and shape of young girls' feet. Similar ideas about femininity and beauty can be seen in Cinderella. The protagonist was lucky enough to have very small feet. Unfortunately, the same can't be said about her stepsisters. To fit into the glass slipper, they had to cut off their toes and heels. Is marriage really worth it? Again, from today's perspective, it probably isn't. However, such a readiness for a sacrifice on the stepsisters' part echoes the same old rite of passage. The stepsisters were prepared to sacrifice a part of their body in the name of being reborn in a different social status. By this logic, things should have worked out for the sisters who gave up their toes and heels for marriage. However, in this story, the archaic beliefs are intertwined with a more recent idea. There is a moral element to the story too. Indeed, Cinderella's sisters made a material sacrifice, but they clearly lack moral qualities. In the fairy tale, they are obviously evil, and evil deserves to be punished. The brutality of folktales is often creatively reinterpreted by fairy tale writers. For example, Hans Christian Andersen mostly wrote original stories. Still, he often used folklore narratives and plot twists in his writing. His fairy tales aren't exactly for children. They are often sad, even though they don't have as many gruesome, graphic details. It's fair to say they were inspired by the folklore tradition. The Little Mermaid sacrifices her voice for a pair of legs, knowing that every step she takes will cause her pain. That's a rite of passage. Elisa from The Wild Swans takes a vow of silence and gathers stinging nettles in graveyards to knit shirts for her brothers, risking her life. Finally, the girl from The Red Shoes repents for her mistakes and begs the executioner to chop off her feet. And he agrees. All these stories were written in the 19th century, but they bear a strong similarity to ancient tales. Many of these stories combine archaism with 19th century morality. The fairy tale logic and archaic themes still impact our culture today. These ideas are constantly reinterpreted in literature, cinema, and animation. Even though fairy tales are becoming less violent over time, the element of mystery and the idea of transformation through overcoming obstacles persists. Learn to decipher the hidden meanings of your beloved fairy tales and read between the lines. Our course, European Literature, can help you become a literary genius and be able to analyze any plot like a pro. But why get one when you can get three? And it's cheaper too. We made course bundles for those who want to dig deeper. Check them out and get 3 courses with 60% off. The link is in the description box. Which scary tale gave you the biggest fright? Share in the comments.